If you think about it, the body is just trying to adapt and trying to look after you. But with the dieting, constant dieting, it really messes things up. And then you find after years of dieting that it becomes even harder to lose that weight. And then, of course, you're regaining it. And that's why so many people come to me and say, it worked really well for me. My first few diets and I did really well, but it didn't work. But then I couldn't control it and they feel really bad about themselves. Clearly, this is just your body's biological systems. It's not their fault. And they couldn't sustain it.
Hello, Marcelle. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am so grateful to have you on here today. I feel like we've planned some really interesting topics to discuss. And before we dive into all of that, I really wanted to ask you about your personal and professional background.
Yeah, sure. So I am heading into, I'm actually in the perimenopause at the moment. That's my age. I've got 2 grown kids and 1 teenager and 3 fur babies. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of professional, I am an emotional and disordered eating specialist. And I work with people who are struggling with whether it's yo-yo dieting, binge eating, emotional eating, bulimia and restrictive eating behaviors. So it's a range of across there. And I'm a BANT-registered nutritionist, a health coach, and also have specialist training in eating disorders, eating psychology and behavior change.
Amazing, amazing. And so how did you get interested in these subjects? Do you have a personal history with emotional eating or binge eating? I'd love to know if you're willing to share.
Yeah, I suppose I'm a bit more unusual in that I haven't had an eating disorder. What sparked my interest in getting into the world of nutrition was I had gut problems and that got me into it. And I was really fascinated. And I still work a lot with people with gut problems because a lot of the people that I work with who were quite disordered and chaotic in their eating often have gut problems going on. But I was finding that people were coming to me and wanting help with weight loss. And I wasn't really interested in working in that field, but I did notice that there was something else going on. There was an emotional depth. There was like deep root stuff going on. And I didn't feel like I had the tools to know how to deal with it. So that's when I went on my journey with the coaching. But then I started the eating disorder training and that sort of blew my mind. And I was just like, wow, this is fascinating. And this stuff could be so useful if I combine it with my nutrition training and with my coaching and, be able to really help people in that area. But, as I said, I was not a disordered eater, but one thing I did notice was that when you train in nutrition, you can become a little bit obsessive. And I could see myself going that way. And what the eating disorder training really helped me to kind of work through that. And so definitely there's an element of where I could see myself going. And
yes, it's so interesting. I remember I had one of my good friends training to be a dietitian when we were like in college. And I just remember there became such a heavy focus on food because that was her world at the moment, right? And so I have seen that impact as well. Like when you are training, it can become a little bit obsessive. When you were working with people and you felt like they wanted help with weight loss or they were binging or dieting, did you ever feel that those people were unaware that they actually had maybe an eating disorder?
Yeah, certainly some people, I think, somewhere along that spectrum of disordered eating, there are a lot of people there. I'm talking about people who have dieted for years and years. They've tried every different diet going. They feel like a failure because it hasn't worked. It's worked and then it hasn't worked. But it's clearly not their fault because of the nature of dieting and what we know about it. And yeah, I do think that they might not have a sort of diagnosable eating disorder, but somewhere along that that disordered eating spectrum where they have certainly elements where they might not have all the criteria, but they have elements of disordered eating. And they often, I find people don't think of themselves in that way because it's so normalized in society, isn't it? That in Western society that we should be constantly striving to shrink our bodies, and as women particularly, to just get smaller, and we'll do anything no matter the cost.
Right. I think you're so right. I think there's that confusion and blurring of the lines, as in like, okay, I'm losing weight in an unhealthy way, but I'm getting celebrated. And like, this is an eating disorder because I don't identify as a person with an eating disorder. So sometimes I find there's like this resistance towards the identity or accepting of what might be the real case. Like if you are struggling and feeling totally like you can't accept, that this is distressing you and causing you mental health troubles, right? There is that fine line, and it's really hard to distinguish at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people that I've worked with, they found they don't feel deserving of that help. Perhaps they don't feel like they're sick enough, but yet this thing is taking over their life completely.
Yes, that is so common as well, that you're not as sick as what you see on TV, right? You're like, I'm not as thin as the person I saw in the documentary in health class, or I'm not needing to be hospitalized or XYZ. So maybe this is just a really extreme diet and I'm okay with that. So yeah, it's a fascinating subject. And I think one thing I was really curious about and wanted to ask you about today is this concept of food addiction. And one thing I'm curious about is, do you think a person can really be addicted to food?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. And it's something that I'm very often, when people call me up to ask about how I can help them, they say, I think I'm addicted to food. And over time, when I, working with them, I start to explain a little bit about my thoughts on that. And absolutely, it's a valid way to feel because, if you're struggling with compulsive eating, or binge eating, or even you might call yourself an emotional eater, a stress eater, you might feel like you're addicted to foods. And certainly we know that certain foods are produced by the food industry, known as hyperpalatable foods, to try and make you consume more of them. So we know that they might trigger particular feel-good hormones like serotonin and dopamine. They might, reduce the chances of you feeling satiated, these particular foods. And that's all, completely valid. But the theory is that with food addiction, that it's similar to alcohol or drug addiction, it makes changes in your brain. And that's something that I think is misleading. When we want to think about food is an essential part of living. We don't have to have alcohol and drugs as an essential, and when you label somebody as a food addict, it implies that sort of wrongdoing on their behalf. But essentially, you need food to survive. And it completely overlooks all the other factors. So there's so many factors involved in binge eating, for example. So things like, has the person been dieting? Has the person been restricting certain foods? All those things, there's so many different things that might play a role in binge eating. But to just put it down to saying it's food addiction, I think is unhelpful, misleading, and also it's quite disempowering. Start to think of it in a different way with my clients, and they start to think, oh, actually, this is something I can change, because they can and they do. If you just label yourself as a food addict or addicted to food or certain foods, then it's very hard to shift out of that mindset that I'm never going to be able to create the change in my life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, because many of those recovery addiction models claim that you're always an addict, right? That's part of your identity, from what I've heard.
Yes, yeah. And another thing we know, that if you start completely saying, I'm never going to eat this food ever again, the likelihood is that it's just not sustainable with food. So the likelihood is it just keeps that sort of binge eating going because you're forbidding yourself these particular foods. And whether it's just a mental restriction or an actual physical restriction, both can play a role and keep that behavior going, really.
Absolutely. So can you explain more the link between like maybe someone experiencing like binge eating, but they think it's food addiction, right? Like, can you explain that experience and why someone might be feeling that way?
Yeah. So I suppose that it's likely they might have been someone who has a history of dieting. So they feel very much that sort of dichotomy around good and bad foods, what I shouldn't be eating. And that can then end up with that sort of food restriction, but then leads to, once you restrict that food, the power of that food, the cravings for that food are very strong. And so at a time where it might be a sort of higher risk situation or where they are exposed to those foods, because let's face it, you know, most people don't isolate themselves in their home and don't go out. They're exposed to these foods at some point. Then it's almost like you're kind of opening the gates and you feel like I can't stop. So then the eating becomes very compulsive and uncontrollable. And that feels very much like an addiction. And then, of course, you're kind of getting that dopamine hit from it. And you're thinking, you know, I can't live without this food, you know, and so it goes on. So it does feel like very much like an addiction to people.
Absolutely. I totally see that. And so when they come to you thinking, I'm really addicted to food, right? I need to break this addiction. How do you get them to see what's actually going on? And what is actually going on, if you were to explain it maybe on a physiological level?
Well, there's a lot of work that I do with people. So we look at many different things. So on a physical level, it might just be that what's going on is that they are restricting food intake. The body will then have some inbuilt mechanisms that slows down metabolism and increases their hunger hormones. And there's an array of different hunger hormones. Ghrelin is one that you might have heard or people might have heard of. It's more well known. And the levels of the hunger hormone will increase. And that is in order to get you to go searching for food, because essentially your body wants to make sure that you have energy. When you're on a diet and you're doing quite restrictive diets, the body is experiencing what it thinks is a famine, and it's thinking, I need to make sure that I am getting enough energy to survive. And it's a way of kind of protecting you and keeping you alive. Obviously not how most people see it. It's like, what is going on with my body? This isn't fair. And the cravings surge. So you get this, you know, intense cravings for certain foods. And it feels like, you know, your appetite feels out of control, etc. So the body has got these inbuilt mechanisms. And we also have something called set point and set point theory. And this is sort of helps to explain why the body does that. Everyone's body wants to be within a certain range, a weight range. And essentially everyone is individual. So everyone has their own weight range. Now, this weight range can change over time. It can often changes as we get older, but also particularly goes up after lots of dieting, yo-yo dieting. So you might you do your first diet, it works really well, you lose a lot of weight, eventually it's unsustainable, you regain the weight. This is what generally happens to the majority of people. Obviously, there's always an anomaly, but the majority of people, we see the weight regain after a certain amount of time. It might be between 1 and 5 years. So they're then starting at that higher point, that slightly higher weight range point, set point. And then if they do another diet, again, lose weight, regain it. Each time their set point goes up. And if you think about it, the body is just trying to adapt and trying to look after you. But with the dieting, constant dieting, it really messes things up. And then you find after years of dieting that it becomes even harder to lose that weight. And then, of course, you're regaining it. And that's why so many people come to me and say, it worked really well for me. My first few diets, and I did really well. But it didn't work, but then I couldn't control it. And they feel really bad about themselves. Clearly, this is just your body's biological systems. It's not their fault. And they couldn't sustain it.
So with the set point range and yo-yo dieting, there's this almost like weight bounce back where you lose the weight and then you gain it back. And sometimes you gain it back a little bit more and that set point increases.
Yes, exactly.
Why is that? Do you know why a person's set point after yo-yo dieting would be a little bit higher than it was before?
I'm not sure we know exactly why that is, but we do know that happens. But I think it's down to your metabolism just being essentially messed up from years of dieting. Yeah. And it needs time to know, your body needs time to know that it's actually, if it's going to get your regular meals in at regular times, you're going to be fed, it's getting nourished. Then, it gives your body a chance for your metabolism to heal. And we know from studies that this can vary between 1 year to many years, depending on the person. There's been a number of different studies that you can look at to see, if metabolism is healed, and it can take time. But certainly by carrying on and continuing with that dieting behavior, you're just going to make it worse.
I hope it is a warning, right? Like someone listening to this might be like, those diets have always let me down and I keep getting the same pattern. I've lost weight, regained weight, and I do notice that my set point seems to be increasing over time. Like, I think it's important for people to recognize that this is actually something that is observed among many chronic dieters. And I've heard, back to your famine response piece of things, that sometimes that set point increases based on like a protection against another famine, which is pretty fascinating when you think about how much the body wants to protect us, right, from disastrous events.
Yeah. I think so many people loathe their bodies because it's not, they're not fitting the thin or beauty ideal. But actually, by focusing on how amazing it is, I think is really important. What is it doing for us? All the stuff that it does is a different way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But I think many people struggle with that.
It's actually really sad that our world has made us hyper-focus on our appearances and almost zoom into like body parts and things that we have so much shame around because it's not aligned with the standard of beauty. But if we can zoom out, we realize it's like almost this beautifully designed masterpiece where things are working together to keep you alive. And even people who are very sick in an eating disorder, you can see signs that their body is fighting really hard to keep them in a stable place. So it is such a shame, but also beautiful to keep that in mind, just remembering what your body can do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how would you say someone might approach healing their relationship with, yo-yo dieting or binge eating? Like, what are your suggestions as someone who wants to embark on this journey?
Well, I look at it in a kind of multifaceted approach. So I often start with the nutrition, which is often not necessarily, if you go down an intuitive eating route, that's kind of the last thing. But what I find with my clients is that they feel very scared. There's a lot of anxiety around letting go of the dieting, what's going to happen. and they need to have some kind of support and guidelines. So I start by just some simple guidelines. And this is not about dieting. This is about what can you add into your diet to help to feel more sustained, to help you control those, those physical cravings, and to reduce that, feeling all over the place and out of control. So we really start with that. And in a very simple way, what can you add in? I always say add in. We're not talking about stripping out. And if you add in certain foods into your diet and reduce the chaos, then you're automatically going to start to feel better. Because, as I said, you reduce your cravings, but you get more energy. You feel better about yourself. And you start to really focus on how you're feeling in your body when that happens. But all sorts of things that can help with gut problems, with hormones, everything, with sleep, energy.
So you mentioned this phrase I want to kind of zoom in on a little, reduce the chaos. Tell me more about that, because I know many chaotic eaters.
Yes. So you might say, well, how do I do that, Marcelle? Because I am a chaotic eater, because I'm a binge eating, for example, or I can't stop eating chocolate or cake or biscuits. Well, it's like actually part of the chaos is because when you're eating those kind of foods, it's doing things like spiking your blood sugar and, causing those. Then you end up with the dip, then you want to eat again. But even things like, I know lots of people who I work with will drink multiple cans of sort of diet soda every day. And that's contributing, because we've got all sorts of things going on there. With the artificial sweeteners, we've got with the caffeine, not feeling properly hydrated. So it's things like that. So it can be a multitude of different things that's going on in the diet that actually, when you start to bring in some things to really help nourish the body, and it doesn't mean boring food. It doesn't have to be boring. It's things that satiate you, that can be delicious as well. You could start to feel so much better and less chaotic. And then the practical skills as well. Some people find it really hard to plan. Some people have a very busy life. Many people do, juggling a lot of stuff. So I try to help guide people to make it easier. So there's some basic planning going on so that they're not running in from work starving hungry, having had a huge gap between not eating, and then it kind of becomes a free-for-all, whatever they can get hold of. Having some plans in place, having a helpful snack with them on their way home from work, for example, or before they leave work. Just, and it's quite individualized, because obviously everyone's life and lifestyle is different. But those are kind of, I would say, the basics of what I think is really important to put in place first. And then you start to feel a lot more confident around that. You can really start to work on the other areas as well as you go through.
So how do you battle a person's temptation to restrict throughout the day? Because I find most people's binge eating cycles are kind of what you just shared. They ignore their hunger cues throughout the day. They're very determined for weight loss during the day. They're making up for the binge they had the night before. And then, they get home and their body goes into that kind of famine response, like, oh my God, uncontrolled eating scenario. How do you structure that and help people fight that, like resist that urge to restrict? Because that is really part of eliminating the chaos.
Absolutely. And that's a key point, actually. That is so important. And with all this stuff in the media around fasting at the moment and trying to hold off, it's really hard to get through to someone. And I think part of it is them gaining that trust with me as, as their coach to help them through, to say, it's going to be okay. I promise you will feel better. If you put a breakfast in that's satisfying, if you have a lunch, and then we know, I do talk to them around the science as well, that we know that people who tend to restrict and hold off eating for as long as possible, because yes, they say, but I didn't feel hungry for a really long time. So I thought, well, I might as well save on the calories and hold off eating. But we know that for the majority of people, they will end up consuming a whole lot more than if they just ate regular meals. And it'd be very distressing because it might be binge-like or emotional eating or grazing throughout the afternoon. So I really try and explain to them that this is key. Let's try it as an experiment and see how you feel. And I have to say that, that's one of probably the most simple parts of what we start doing, even though it feels very scary for some people who've sort of got stuck into this fasting. They feel so much better. And it becomes one of the things that they know, well, they start to observe their eating patterns, that they will say, I missed my breakfast accidentally or whatever the other day. And that really sort of destabilized me throughout the day. So I begin to get my clients to really start to observe without judgment, with that sort of compassionate lens. Let's just be curious. Let's understand what might have led to that eating behavior. Now that, there are obviously many other things, not just the physical side of things as well, but that's a key part, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that's one thing. It's actually really interesting when I guide people through binge eating as a recovery coach as well. There are significant changes to the person's pattern, like adding more food throughout the day or opening yourself up to eating carbs again or something like that, where it's a simple change, but it can really transform your binge eating, and heal your binge eating pattern just by going into giving yourself a little bit more structure throughout the day, a little bit more accountability, awareness in like how your body responds, observing yourself. It is really fun for me as a coach to watch someone come back the next week being like, I started adding like some, a snack at this time of the day, and I just felt way more calmer at night. And you're like, oh, who would have thought? It's fun and eye-opening to see that.
Yeah, no, I love seeing that when people come back and they've really embraced it and they really can see the benefits. And, but I appreciate that for some people, that's a big deal. It's hard.
It is. It is a big accomplishment to have that shift if you've been a restrictor binger person for a long time. So speaking, you did a great job speaking to kind of the practical side of things. What about the emotional piece?
Yeah, so the emotional side is obviously a big thing. And I see this with many people where they've developed this coping mechanism for many years. It's almost becomes their computer program in their brain because for whatever reason, they've struggled with coping with difficult emotions. And what's happened is that over time, it's just become a kind of way to numb or push down emotions. So we see this a lot with binge eating. And we have to do a lot of work around that. But before we do that, we start to do a lot around the thoughts that are going on, because that old sort of computer program has developed over time in the brain, where you pick up all those old beliefs about things, about food, about dieting, about their body. And we start to work on that and start to unravel all those old beliefs and thoughts and opinions around things. So I almost start with that first before the emotions side, which is obviously so key. They're connected though. So in, the thoughts that then can lead to the emotions and the eating behavior. But sometimes it's the emotions then trigger the thoughts that then lead to more emotions and eating behavior. So yeah, there's a lot to get stuck into there.
What are some of the more common emotions that propel this relationship with food?
Yeah, so it's usually any kind of feeling of discomfort. And often people find that they can't necessarily label what they're feeling. They know it's uncomfortable and they don't want to feel it. So it can be anything from loneliness, sadness, anxiety, stress, overwhelm. In my book, I've got a really sort of comprehensive feelings chart that can help people to start to label. And it's sort of broken down into sections because it's sometimes really hard for people to actually be able to observe and label what it is they're feeling. But the more you can become aware of it, the more you can do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think the emotional identification, at least for me, as I'm recovered from my eating disorder, but I'm not recovered from everything in life. Like I still have difficult emotions to work through. And I find the emotional identification has always been half the battle for me. Like at least more than half is like if I can pause and just say, this is what I'm feeling, it helps diffuse whatever tension I'm feeling in the body, transform the energy that's stuck in the body. So I love that you have that little identifier chart in your book. Yeah, it's so helpful.
Yeah. And what you mentioned about the diffusing, there's a wonderful technique called cognitive diffusion, which is probably it's essentially what you've said, where you're like, I notice that I'm feeling and the emotion, and then you start to notice where you're feeling it in the body. And that just gives you that bit of space to slow down and to sit with it for a minute and know that it's okay and it will pass. So it's a great technique to use.
What's it called? I just want to make sure I heard it correctly.
Cognitive diffusion.
Cognitive diffusion. Oh, okay. I don't think I knew there was a little word attached to that, or phrase. Cognitive.
Yeah.
I feel that. I experience that whenever I have a little bit of an emotion come up. That diffusion is very real if you can identify it and sit with it and feel compassion towards yourself and the emotions you're having. Take a breath, pause. It is so helpful. And I imagine part of the work you do, you can see that in your clients, like that emotional awareness really can start to transform their experience.
Yeah, it's incredible. I just love it. I mean, the next session when they say, this is what I discovered this week, and they really reflect on it. And it just is so empowering when they begin to have these sort of light bulb moments.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What about the beliefs that you've unpacked? Like, what are some of the common beliefs, like maybe one or two most common that you've heard like binge eaters or chronic dieters express to you?
I just can't do it is very often that mindset, that deep belief that they can't do it, that self-efficacy. And that's something that I think is so important to work on. And working on that is really about noticing, some of the things we talked about earlier, when people come back to you and say, oh yeah, I put that in and I felt great, or I changed the way I did something and I realized that that's, that I was able to do that. So it's like small wins can really help with that and help people to move forward and change that belief. And then they're like, yes, actually, maybe I can do this. And that just grows.
That's why I love being a coach, is helping someone build that evidence that, in fact, you can do these things, right? We don't need to minimize your accomplishments anymore. Like, let's celebrate the small wins and build a sense of motivation and hope based on what you've been able to do, big or small. And I love when someone can feel a little bit inspired towards the direction maybe they never felt was possible before.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. It's so key, isn't it, to the work?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, absolutely. So I know you mentioned you have a book coming out. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that before we wrap up, and also a little bit more about where people can find you if they want to work with you.
Thank you. Yes. So the book, I think by the time this drops, it could well be out, this episode. So it's called The Binge Freedom Method, and it's essentially 4 pillars to overcoming binge eating and emotional eating. So we look at nourish, which is what I talked a little bit about around the nutrition side, nutritional therapy side. Then balance is very much about thinking about things like your circadian rhythm, your hormones, your gut, your sleep, your stress, all of that, and the impact that has on your eating behaviors and how you can work through some of those things to really help you, reduce the sort of impact that those things will be having on driving that eating behavior forward. And then we've got think and feel. So as I mentioned, we're really working on the thoughts, and there's lots of strategies, there's lots of things to do in there. And there's a downloadable workbook as well, and a downloadable recipe book as well to help people. So I wanted it to be a really sort of multifaceted approach, but with really kind of simple steps that people can gradually work through over time, to work through all the areas and to create that change.
Oh my gosh, that sounds really exciting. Congratulations on the new book. I love that you have a little bit of a framework set up in there too. I think that's always helpful. And also, just in general, could you share how people could find you if they want to work with you?
Sure. So I'm on Instagram at Marcelle Rose Nutrition. So do come and, say hello, come into my DMs and say hello, ask me questions. My website is marcellerosenutrition.co.uk. I'm also on Facebook, Marcelle Rose Nutrition, and I have a free Facebook community called the Food Freedom Collective, which is basically helping people, overcome yo-yo dieting, binge eating, emotional eating, that kind of thing.
Exciting. I love it. Love a good Facebook group. Those are fun. Okay, Marcelle, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a true pleasure. And I'm hopeful that those who are listening have learned something new and maybe have gotten some helpful insight from you today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You're so welcome.